And I thought the Big 12 was going to be really hard to rank. This one was even harder, for sure. The SEC, I think, in my opinion, has improved a lot, at least in terms of how many teams are pretty viable throughout the years. Obviously, you had your Kentuckys, now you got your Alabamas, and you've had a few teams in there up and down, like Tennessee and stuff, Texas, but I feel like there's a really good mix of just a lot of potential good teams in the SEC this year, and it was by far the hardest conference to rank so far. But let's go ahead and just dive in with the bottom here. We have a few teams down here that I don't think are really going to be looking to contend this year. Starting off at the bottom, number 16 is going to be LSU. They just didn't really improve at all, to be honest. They have a few guys that they tried to pick up. Jordan Sears, who averaged 22 points per game, but it was at UT Martin, so we'll see if that transfers. Cam Carter was a good transfer, and he's from Kansas State. He was actually a producing player for them, but that was about it. They're going to need a lot of other guys to step up, most notably Jalen Reed, who was a former top 75 recruit in 2022 and hasn't really lived up to that number, at least. But it doesn't really seem like they're going to be doing a ton this next year. At 15 is going to be Georgia. So we got some of the kings of the SEC down here in basketball. That's just how it is for basketball. But for Georgia, I think they start like a theme of the SEC teams that are down here, and that's just not really knowing who's going to step up. They don't really have a bad roster. It's just a lot of flyers on lower school guys, or maybe other guys that just couldn't really get minutes on other Power 5 schools. But they lost a lot. Their best returning player is going to be Blue Kane, who averaged 9 points per game. He's a former top 60 recruit last year, so he's just going to be a sophomore, so maybe he takes a big step up. They have transfers like Dakota Lefew, who averaged 17 at Mount St. Mary's. Deshane Montgomery, who averaged 13 also at Mount St. Mary's, so they brought over two Mount St. Mary's players. They did get a Power 5 guy, Tyron Lawrence, who averaged 14 at Vanderbilt, but Vanderbilt obviously wasn't a great school last year. But I think their biggest thing is just going to be recruiting. They got Asa Newell, who is who's ranked number 12 in ESPN's top 100. They also got Simoto Cairo, who is 49th. So they have some younger guys, and that's probably what they're going to be focusing on is the future for Georgia. Next is going to be Oklahoma. They're not necessarily bad. I just don't really see any upside for them, to be honest. They have a lot of solid guys. It's just no one who really stands out. Their transfers include a lot of mid-major guys who they're hoping can step up, lower, at least not have their competition with it being so much better. Their play gets worse. We'll see how it goes. But the most notable one is going to be Duke Miles. He averaged 17 points per game at High Point, who was a tournament team. Kobe Elvis is a younger guard from Dayton who averaged 9 points per game, who was also a tournament team. They took a flyer on a young Alabama guy who couldn't get much playing time over there, Muhammad Wegu, and they also got Jeremiah Fears, who was number 24 in ESPN's top 100 for recruits. So, they got to have a lot, obviously, to go right for them, but I just don't see them really doing that this year. And then 13 is going to be Missouri. They grabbed some solid guys on some good teams. Mark Mitchell from Duke, Tony Perkins from Iowa, both good. They have other young guys that they're going to need to step up, kind of like Anthony Robinson, who is a junior now. And they got some good recruits in Marcus Allen, who's number 71 in ESPN's top 100, Anor Bodang, who is 31st. But again, similar to a lot of these lower teams, they are getting good recruits and getting some guys. I just don't see them competing. So if that's the bottom of the SEC might not be so bad. Then we have a gap here, and it's only going to be two teams. I think that shows you what the SEC is like. But these are two teams that I would not really bet on to make the bubble, but I don't think they're in the lower gap of, they're just looking at next year and it's not even close. No, they clearly made an effort and they could be viable for sure. Number 12 is going to be South Carolina. They were the shocker of last year, won a lot of games, rose a ton, and I believe made the tournament in the NCAA tournament from the SEC, and they were not supposed to be very good. But I think they will come back down to earth a little bit this year. They lost their three best players, most notably Michi Johnson and Talon Cooper. They have other returning players, most notably Murray Boyles, Colin Murray Boyles, sorry. He's a forward who was a top 100 freshman last year, so he'll be a sophomore this year looking to improve. Their transfers, they have Jamari Thomas, who averaged 16 points per game at Norfolk State, but I think he'll probably just be a role player in the SEC, to be honest. Nick Pringle was a good forward on that Bama team last year. He's coming over, but he's not necessarily game-changing or anything, so unless they have some diamonds in the rough, which is very possible, that's why I have him not in the lower tier gap, I do think they kind of have to be in this tier. And then above them is going to be Vanderbilt. I do want to give Vanderbilt the respect, even though it is tough because it's the SEC. They are another group with a lot of roster turnover. They have a new coach in Mark Byington, who's from JMU, James Madison, who beat Wisconsin in the tournament this past year and got a job at the SEC. I don't think they really have higher-end potential to make the tournament at all, or even make any noise in the tournament if they happen to, but they have to be here because they have a pretty high floor, and I think they're just trying to build a program just to show that they're competent so they can get future recruits to come over. Some most notable guys: Jason Edwards averaged 19 at North Texas, Grant Huffman averaged 13 at Davidson, Chris Mannon 12 at Cornell. So all three of these guys, lower schools, were contributing, but they got some guys from Power 5 that were like solid role players slash solid starters. AJ Hogard from Michigan State, Tyler Nickel at Virginia Tech, MJ Collins also at Virginia Tech, Alex Henway at Clemson. All of them averaged single points per game except AJ Hogard. He was at 10. But I think all these guys, they're just solid. Like, they are probably going to be good players, but nothing crazy. So they're all competent. I just don't think they're going to have the upside to do anything in terms of making the tournament, but they'll be a team that you have to take seriously and not get tripped up on. So they'll be like maybe a matchup check in the SEC, but they're not in the bottom tier for sure. Next gap is going to be two other teams. Yeah, there's another gap. This is where I think they are above in terms of they have to be respected as, yes, potentially making the tournament, but they're ones that I personally just don't really know where to put, and I do like other teams above them. So I think these are teams that are going to be like, hey, they're in the middle of the bubble. Like, they're not necessarily on the higher end, the lower end, at least in my opinion. They could make it, they could not. Really just depends on a lot of stuff. I don't really know exactly where I want to put them, so I kind of made this extra tier here. And that is going to be number 10, Florida, which Florida is actually ranked, I believe, 21st, and they have talent. I'm just not as much of a believer as others are. I still think they're a good team who is very much tournament viable, but I just don't think they're a shoo-in to make the tournament at all. I feel like they're kind of just there, to be honest, and I think they low-key got a bit worse. They returned their best player in Walter Clayton, who's good. He had 17 points per game, but they lost their three other best players, so that does definitely hurt. They did return Will Richard and Alex Condon, who are going to need to step up a little bit. But the only real transfer they got was Elijah Martin from FAU, who's good, but I don't think he's going to make it for the production that they lost. And they got no real recruits at all that are going to make you think like they're going to have an impact right away. So this is still a good team, but I don't think they should be ranked, and I kind of have them a little lower in the SEC. And then the second team in this tier is Mississippi State. I have them at number 9. This is a tough team to place, to be honest. They're good. I know that for sure, but they changed a lot, and I don't really think they're worthy of being in the next tier, at least right now. They have, like I said, a lot of roster turnover, but I think you can make an argument that they did get better. They returned their best scorer, which is always good, Josh Hubbard, 17 points per game. They got two good rotational forwards, Cameron Matthews and Keyshawn Murphy. Both were there last year and are young, so they'll be able to do better this year. But they had a lot of good young players on, or not necessarily young, but just a lot of good players on underperforming teams last year. Kanye Clary, who averaged 16 at Penn State, who was lower in the Big Ten. Caldell Harris Jr., 13 points per game at Boston College. Also, they were lower in the SEC, the ACC. And then they got two younger guys they were former top recruits, and they're good, taller guards that just have been kind of inefficient on other SEC teams, and that's going to be RJ Melendez probably is how you say that, who averaged barely 10 points per game at Georgia. Obviously didn't have a great year. And then Riley Kugel, who was at Florida, who I actually do like, and I think that was someone that Florida probably could have kept, and I think he could have improved. So Mississippi State, they're not super deep or anything, but they do have a lot of potentials, and I think that's kind of why they're lower, is just they're like potentially good. But I do think they are for sure possibly making the tournament if other teams, I think, do worse. I think that'd be the biggest thing. They have to do better, other teams have to do worse, and then they'll be in there. So that's why I'm in this tier. Then the next tier has got a lot of teams. A lot of teams in this tier, and I think all of these teams are tournament viable. I think either high bubble or low, like in the tournament, and some of them I think are for sure in the tournament. I just didn't really want to. I didn't know where the gap lied. I wasn't sure, because I think all these teams could either maybe just barely fall out or just get in or for sure be in based on the competition in the SEC. It's crazy. Let's start off with number 8. I have Ole Miss. I really wanted to put them, or I really want to put them in this next tier, and I am, because I feel like there's a slight gap here, and I'm going to bank on Ole Miss's upside to potentially be a tournament team. They returned their best player from last year, Matthew Murrell, 16 points per game, obviously very good, including 2 other double-digit scorers in Jameem Brakefield and Jalen Murray, forward and guard respectively, and both are really good offensive and defensive players at their position. Murray's a good offensive guard, Brakefield's a good defensive forward / center. Now they did lose Alan Flanagan, who was very good for them, 15 points per game, their second leading scorer. But they had a really underrated transfer portal. Mikael Brown-Jones, who averaged almost 20 at UNC Greensboro, who had a pretty good year last year and has made the tournament in recent years. Malika Dia, who averaged 17 at Belmont. Playmaking guard, and Sean Padula, who averaged 15 at Virginia Tech, one of their better players at Virginia Tech. And then Dre Davis, who was one of the many guards that were at Seton Hall that all averaged like double digits, and they're all pretty good, and he averaged 15 points per game there. So 2 forwards, 2 guards. I think all these guys are probably going to contribute in some way, along with the guys that are returning that I just mentioned. And they have Coach Chris Beard, who was with Texas Tech, obviously, when they made their run to the title game. Then went to Texas, got the Texas job, had his issues, got kicked out, but is now back, and he's trying to build what has mostly been, I think, an irrelevant basketball program at Ole Miss, at least in terms of recent memory. But I would say watch out for them this year. I wouldn't be surprised if they finish higher than this, or lower, obviously. Their downfall would be probably their defense. It's just not really there, but they really remind me of like an earlier Alabama team under Nate Oates, where they're just getting all these really good offensive players and are just trying to run up the score and potentially shock a few teams. And I think that's what you do for upsets. It's the upset teams are more likely just going to be like, hey, we're just going to run down, shoot all these shots, play high tempo and everything like that, and try to throw the other team off. So Ole Miss, I do have in this higher tier. 7 is Texas. They were kind of hard to rank. Texas went over a lot of changes, but I think this roster is good enough to show improvement. The only thing for me is just going to be their head coach, and Rodney Terry. I think we're going to see if he's for real. He was thrusted into this role after the Chris Beard exit 2 years ago, and I think we're going to see if he's for real and see if he should stay. Last year, I think for Texas was a bit disappointing. They did make the tournament. They were 7th in the Big 12. They finished 9-9, and they finished as a 7 seed. But they did barely lose to number 2 Tennessee. So I think the regular season was disappointing, but at least they made the tournament and had a close call in the second round. They have an above average amount of good players, I would say. Only thing would just be their depth. A lot has changed, though. They lost all 4 of their top scorers, including the biggest one being Max Asmus, who was the star at Oral Roberts when Oral Roberts had their upsets recently. But they got some good players. Tremont Mark was a good guard for Arkansas, 16 points per game. Arthur Kaluma had 14 points per game and is a good defender when he was at Kansas State, and then previously before that, Creighton. Jordan Pope, he was given the reins at Oregon State, and he's very young. He'll kind of take a back seat and will ideally learn to be at least a little bit more efficient, but he had 17 points per game last year. They got 2 starters who each had double digits for Indiana State last year. They're both good guards who can produce, I think, at least relatively to what they had at the big level. I just don't think they're necessarily going to be for sure starters. They returned 1 key starter in Caden Shedrick, who is a good defensive forward. He's actually from Raleigh, by the way. He was on that Virginia team when Virginia had their loss to Furman in the tournament. But the biggest one, I think, is going to be their top recruit in Trey Johnson. Trey Johnson can really light it up. He's one of the highest recruits, and I think he'll be the X factor to see how good this team is going to be and if he can really consistently perform. Next, at number 6, is going to be Tennessee. I do have them falling a little bit, and I have them a little lower than a lot of other people, I think. I think they're still good, for sure, but they're not what they were last year, and I do have them a little lower. They have a lot of key starters that left, Dalton Knecht being the biggest one, obviously. Went to the NBA, but they lost 3 other starters along with him as well. The only return, kind of the main one, is Zakai Ziegler, and he's going to need to take more of an offensive role without losing his solid efficiency, which I think can happen. They also have Jemai Mashak, who was a younger guard, and he's going to need to fill the 2 role. And they attempted to get their Dalton Knecht 2.0 by grabbing a few highly performing guys at mid-major schools. Chaz Lanier is a guard from North Florida. That'll probably be the biggest one to look forward to see how he does. Igor Milicic was from Charlotte, and he's pretty solid. They also got a good contributor in Felix Okpara, who's a really savvy defender. So they're not a bad team. Rick Barnes-led teams have always been good defensively. They always have a good high floor. But without Dalton Knecht, I'm leaving a little bit I'm just leaving a little worried about who is going to pick up all that offensive production, or at least if they're going to have a similar offense to where they don't have to grind out every single game. So that's kind of why I have them a little lower, but they're still good. I still have them at 6. Number 5, I have Kentucky. It's a new era for Kentucky, and while they're not super flashy or anything, I think they are flourishing with a lot of their vets that they have, and they bring with them just a good new wave of experience that Kentucky fans probably aren't really used to. They have 1 notable returner. But other than that, it's all like brand new. They're ranked in the top 5 in terms of experience. Almost all their guys that are going to get minutes are seniors. Maybe 1 junior, I think, is in there. They got 4 guards who I expect all to get minutes from. Otego Owe is a tall 2-way guard from Oklahoma. Lamont Butler was on. He's a really good defensive guard from those San Diego State teams. Kerr Krissa, who's an electric offensive player from West Virginia that I really love to be a 6-man, kind of like that Tyler Hero, Reed Shepard role. And then Jackson Robinson, who's similar to Kerr and is a great offensive player. He's kind of more of a liability on defense, though. They got Andrew Carr from Wake Forest, who's a really good forward, probably going to be their most consistent player. He's not a star or a superstar, but he's just really good, and he'll be consistent at the 4. Brandon Garrison, a really tall, kind of do-it-all for center from Oklahoma. He can pass, rebound. Not really a scorer, but will get you a layup, a few, maybe like 6+ points or whatever if you need it. And they added a lot of other guys from lower schools who have had success. Amari Williams from Drexel, Anthony Alomar from FDU, if you remember those FDU teams. Kobe Brea was also a good guard from Dayton who's going to get minutes. So they just have a lot of experienced guys. They also got a top 35 recruit in point guard Travis Perry. So they have a lot of experienced players. I think this is a for sure good team that might enjoy some actual tournament success with their experience if the coaching is really there, because I guess that seemed to be the issue recently with them with Coach Cal. Which, speaking of Coach Cal, I have his team above Kentucky, and I have them at number 4. I think this is the most intriguing team, and it's kind of the most like up in the air SEC team, maybe in the entire country. While they are big question marks in terms of how they're going to do, I do still feel confident enough to put them in this safe tournament tier and up at number 4. Obviously, the biggest thing is going to be how Coach Calipari what's he going to do at the helm now after his continued tournament disappointments? How is he going to do now that he gets to stay in the SEC? And I know it's obviously a brand new team, but I feel pretty solid about the talent that he has. They grabbed Jonas Adu from Tennessee, and then they also get DJ Wagner, which Cal brings with him from Kentucky last year. One of them is really good at defense. The other one really good at offense, respectively. Adu is a good defender. DJ is a good offensive player. So I think those are good experienced guys that you have. The biggest one is Johnell Davis, for sure. He was the lead guard for those FAU teams. He averaged 18 points per game last year. I think he can absolutely lead and still have similar production to what he had at the lower level in the American. I think he can have similar production in the SEC, even if it does take a little bit. Then they get, as Coach Cal always does, they got good recruits. Boogie Fland is number 14 in terms of ESPN's Top 100. Carter Knox, who's number 26. Billy Richmond's number 38. So they got 3 good guys. Boogie is probably going to be the best one out of them, and we'll expect to have early production out of. I see the worries of these Coach Cal teams. He'll definitely have to prove it, but in terms of making it, at least making the tournament, I don't see a world or where they'll have a giant issue of doing that. I think they seem to have a good mix of like veteran players and young guys, and they're not just focusing on one end of the spectrum or the other, which is kind of what he's done in the past. So hopefully he's learned his lesson about team construction and maybe has some success, and we'll see how they do in the tournament. And then the last team in this tier, at number 3, I have Texas A&M. I was very tempted to have them at this tier in the beginning, or at this position in the beginning, and I didn't. I had them at like 4 or 5, but I, in the end, ended up moving them up because I think they are just a for sure improved team from last year, and they've shown to be good in the past, for sure. And there's just a lot of question marks down below with new coaches and all that stuff and roster turnover. This is a good team last year who had a crazy overtime game versus number 1 Houston in the second round last year. So if they won that game, maybe they could have gone farther. They returned their best player, who's one of the best guards in the SEC, in Wade Taylor. He does have a bit of an efficiency issue, but he's still good. He's a real scrappy defender, even at 6 foot. They did lose their second best player in Tyrese Radford, but that's it. They got every single guy back. The transfer portal even gave them some few good guys from Power 5 schools. Zolrich Phelps, who averaged 14 points per game at SMU. He did have an undisclosed injury. I'm not sure when he'll be back, but they got Farrell Payne, who averaged 10 points per game at Minnesota, and he's going to be good as well. A majority of their main expected contributors are returning players who are all just going to need to take a little bit of a step up, which I totally expect that to happen for sure. Henry Coleman, Solomon Washington, each are going to get uptick in minutes, and I think they're definitely going to be better this upcoming year. And probably take over the minutes that Tyrese Radford had. Their defense, I think, is going to be a bit better this year as well. So I just think they have a lot of continuity. They return a lot of people. They get at least 2 guys that are definitely going to play for them in the transfer portal, and young guys that are going to take a step up. So I think they have all the makings of a good tournament team. I don't think they're in this next tier of really competing in terms of they should be favorites for the conference title, but obviously anyone in this tier is viable of winning the conference. That's the case for any, rankings video I make for conference champions and everything like that. Like NC State obviously won it last year. Like if I have them in that tier, they're viable. I'm just not necessarily betting on it. But they're still very good, and I think they will be another tournament team who will probably be a higher seed this upcoming year. Then we have the last tier of the contenders. Only 2 teams in this tier, and I think they are a step above the rest of the SEC and will be probably 1 and 2 seeds respectively in the NCAA tournament. At number 2, I have Auburn. I think this is a bounce back year for Auburn. They return one of the best and most efficient players in the country in Johnny Broome, who was ranked analytically as the best incoming college basketball player this year. They're absolutely right there with Alabama, I think purely due to their balanced nature. Defense is obviously much better than Alabama, but I think they have the ability to keep up offensively with Bama, which is crazy to say because Bama is like one of the best offensive teams in the country. They return most of their guys, the biggest one being Chad Baker-Mazara. They have other guys like Denver Jones, Chauncey Johnson. All are tall, experienced guards. They got Miles Kelly, who's a guard from Georgia Tech, averaged 13 points per game. J.P. Pegas, who was the best player at Furman last year, who had 18 points per game. Tahad Pettiford is a 33rd ranked recruit, so they got young guys, transfers from lower schools, higher schools, returning best players, didn't lose a ton of people. Like, I think they just have a lot. And if Johnny Broome continues his great play, which he had a player efficiency rating of 32 last year, which was one of the best. And I think if one of their many players that they have returning just takes a little bit of a step up, they're totally right there for the SEC title. And I think they will probably finish at least maybe as a 2 to 3 seed in the NCAA tournament. Which leads us obviously to number 1, which just has to be Alabama. It just has to be. They're similar, honestly, to UNC this year, to be honest. I think except they're UNC, but just all on a higher scale. They returned an elite guard who is in contention for the Wooden Award, Mark Sears, one of the best players in the country. Grant Nelson, their second best player, is back as a key starting forward. They got one of the best transfers in the country, Clifford Omari, or Omowarie, I think is. I'm so bad with pronouncing names. Clifford, we'll just say Clifford. He returned. He's going to be playing center, and he averaged 10 points per game at Rutgers and is a very good defensive center. The biggest X factor, though, is going to be Aiden Holloway. He's a sophomore transfer from Auburn. Lots of potential at shooting guard and going to need to be more efficient, but they snagged him from their rival Auburn. I think he might be the biggest deal. Aiden Holloway, remember that name. Ratrell Wrightswell returns as a two-way small forward, and they get a top 10 freshman in Darion Reed. So they're deep, they're tall, they have a lot of scoring. Only thing is their reliable defense is not there, which the reason I did not have them going to the Final Four last year was because of their defense. That was why they finished even after the Final Four and making it. They finished with a defensive efficiency that was ranked 111th. Which was like one of the lowest ever for a Final Four team. So I think with Clifford coming in now, it'll help their defense be like irrelevant and bad in the SEC to at least somewhat respectable. And I have no issue with their ranking in terms of where they're ranked in the preseason poll. They're a top team for sure. They'll be a 1 seed, and they should be competing for the title. We'll just see if they get the right path to go, if the offense continues where it was, and if the defense gets a little better, which I think is all very possible for this Bama team. They could dominate in both in college, obviously have for all those years. Maybe all that is going to transfer to basketball with Nate Oates at the helm for Alabama this year.